John Bolton is a former Trump's national security advisor and former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Welcome to our program, Ambassador Bolton.
Glad to be with you.
U.S. President-elect Donald Trump said that ending the war in Ukraine would be his #1 foreign policy priority. Also, Trump's team will try to organize a ceasefire in Ukraine. What can happen if Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on Ukraine?
Well, Trump has threatened that there would be serious consequences for Russia if they didn't engage. And that may well be the case, but I think the greater likelihood is that Putin will graciously follow Trump's request and agree to a ceasefire and the commencement of negotiations, because I think from the Russian perspective, if they can freeze a ceasefire along the actual line of control inside Ukraine, their hope is that as negotiations in Geneva or wherever they turn out to be drag on, that separation along the line of control becomes a new border between Russia and Ukraine, which would obviously be a terrible setback for the Ukrainians.
Also, there are some discussions that in case of a ceasefire in Ukraine, Ukrainian armed forces could, or Ukrainian government can regain control of those occupied territories after the Putin's departure in the future. What is your take on that?
Well, I wouldn't count on that coming. I mean, look, the Russian government today is not a government as we understand it. It's one-man rule. There are no checks and balances, no competing structures. We don't know what the Russian government will look like when Putin passes from the scene, and we don't know how long it will be until that happens. So I'm very afraid that things like what Vice President-elect J.D. Vance suggested in the campaign, that you'd set up a demilitarized zone along the ceasefire line, a kind of partition that's been compared to North and South Korea, is not a model that Ukraine wants to follow. The armistice in Korea began in 1953 and is still going on. So, almost 75 years later, the two Koreas remain divided. That's not something that I think is in Ukraine's interest.
But you are confident that Vladimir Putin will agree with Trump's proposal and would like to have a ceasefire in Ukraine, for example, next year?
Yes, I think it is in his interest. I think it's a way for him out of a situation that's becoming increasingly difficult. The Ukrainian response to the Russian invasion resulted in a significant military defeat for Russian combat arms. Casualties are extraordinarily high. They've lost enormous amounts of equipment. The Black Sea Fleet has been substantially damaged. The sanctions that were imposed after the invasion in 2022, while very far from effective, have nonetheless caused economic harm to Russia. I think Putin would like a breathing spell, a chance to recover, but he doesn't want to do it in a way that makes him look weak or makes it look like he's being forced into it. The intervention of his good friend, Donald Trump, gives him a hook on which to base the agreement to enter into negotiations and the ceasefire. He may miss the opportunity, but it would be in his interest to accept it.
President Zelensky says that Vladimir Putin fears only Donald Trump and China. Is he right? And can you imagine a scenario in which Trump goes into confrontation with Vladimir Putin?
Well, anything is possible with Trump since he doesn't have a national security philosophy. He sees things through the prism of what benefits Donald Trump. I don't think Putin fears Trump. I think it's actually much worse than that. I think he believes he can manipulate Trump, that he knows how to flatter him, he knows his weaknesses, and that he can play him in ways that other leaders, including President Zelensky, can't. And I don't think he fears China as much as we might like him to fear China. He needs China, and he knows it. He doesn't like it, but he's got plenty of allies, unfortunately, in this fight. It's not as we've imagined it for the last several years. Ukraine supported by NATO against Russia alone. It's Russia, supported by China, supported by Iran, supported by North Korea. It's a much deeper opponent on the other side than I think many people understand.
According to the latest Trump's interview with Times, Donald Trump does not support U.S. authorization for Ukraine to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with American-made weapons. But how can Donald Trump really get Vladimir Putin to negotiations table without putting pressure on him and without allowing Ukraine to destroy Russian targets inside Russia?
Well, I think we should have granted authorization for that kind of use of the weapons about 3 years ago. I mean, this is part of the reason the non-strategic way the assistance was delivered, parceled out after long internal debates, that's made it difficult, if not impossible, for Ukraine to respond really in a strategic way to the Russian military incursion. So, Trump doesn't think these things through. He tosses off ideas which he may or may not actually believe in or remember the next week. So I think that the limitation on the use of American arms may be a temporary issue, but it's a political question. How best for Ukraine to avoid being taken advantage of by the Russians in negotiations. And we see Chancellor Scholz of Germany speaking with Putin. We see Viktor Orban of Hungary about to speak with Putin. Others may as well. And I'm very worried that as the European Union members see the apparent weakening of American resolve, that their resolve is weakening too. So it's a very dangerous point for Ukraine here, and one that unfortunately I think Putin will try and take full advantage of.
Also, according to the Polish newspaper Rzeczpospolita, French President Emmanuel Macron is trying to coordinate, to organize a European coalition which can put boots on the ground in Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. What is your take on that? And would it be in Ukraine? Would such scenario be in Ukraine's favor if European troops are deployed to Ukraine to enforce such a ceasefire, demilitarized zone?
Look, I think it's very dangerous for Ukraine to agree to anything like a substantial demilitarized zone. And it doesn't matter whether it's UN peacekeepers or NATO peacekeepers. Once you put troops on the ground, you are hardening that ceasefire line and making it more difficult to achieve at some point diplomatically what all NATO members say is their objective in aiding Ukraine, which is the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. And by the way, what I at least haven't heard suggestions like J.D. Vance's or Emmanuel Macron's cover, is this demilitarized zone going to be along the battlefield inside Ukraine today only, or will there be a demilitarized zone on the existing Ukraine-Russian border to the north of the Donbass region? Are you really going to put peacekeepers all along that entire border? And by the way, will they extend to the Ukraine border with Belarus as well? It shows a reflection that many of these suggestions come from people who really don't understand the geography that Ukraine faces.
If you were Trump's national security advisor right now, it's a possible scenario. For example, what would you advise Trump on Ukraine, on the situation in Ukraine? Would you advise to move forward with ceasefire talks or just to continue to support Ukraine until its victory on the ground?
Well, I certainly wouldn't favor ceasefire talks at this point. I'd get a rationalization of NATO assistance to Ukraine. I'd come up with a plan to use that assistance strategically to drive Russian forces back. And I wouldn't negotiate until we were in more of a position of strength. Look, this has been a grinding war for both Ukraine and Russia. But in any war of attrition, the big country typically, unfortunately, ends up winning. And that's Putin knows that. And he's counting on short attention spans in Europe and in the United States, particularly Donald Trump's short attention span. So I wouldn't at this point begin negotiations, but I'd get our military assistance program better aligned than it was for the last 3 years. and see if it can make a difference. The time to negotiate is when Ukraine's moving forward, not moving backward.
As you know Donald Trump personally, what would be your advice for President Zelensky? What is the best way for Ukrainian president to deal with Donald Trump right now from Ukrainian perspective?
Well, I don't know if President Zelensky plays golf or not, but he may want to take it up. That worked for Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan. I think Abe had the best relationship, had the most impact on Trump of any foreign leader in Trump's first term. So President Zelensky might want to take a look at that. I think in the past few weeks, it appears almost that's what Zelensky has done. Stay in constant touch with Trump. Don't ask for something every time you call, but just call him up and chat. Be a phone buddy with him. Come and visit him. It takes a lot of time and attention. I know the president has many other things he needs to do, but convincing Trump that it's in Donald Trump's personal interest not to let Vladimir Putin and the Russians be victorious in Ukraine, that's the way to get the maximum out of Trump.
Is it possible for anyone to establish friendly relations with Donald Trump?
Donald Trump's friendships last as long as they're beneficial to Donald Trump. So finding ways to make it clear that he will go down in history as a great leader if he sticks with the policy and improves the policy of aiding Ukraine, that it will benefit Ukraine and benefit him. I think he would be attracted to that.
U.S. intelligence warns that Russia can fire another intercontinental experimental ballistic missile on Ukraine in the matter of days, according to the recent American intelligence assessment. What is your reaction and assessment of such a blackmail strategy for Russia to launch another intercontinental missiles on Ukraine? Do you see this as a threat to Ukraine, or also a threat try to blackmail the next U.S. administration?
Well, the use of intercontinental ballistic missiles is intended as a form of intimidation. But I think we've got to be realistic about that. ICBMs are intended to go at intercontinental range. That's what they're named for. So firing such a missile from Russia into Ukraine is a waste of money, basically. It may be intended as a threat against the United States. Putin has used threats that the White House, the Biden White House, has interpreted as risking a wider war to great effect. We collectively failed to deter Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but our conduct of the war has been deterred by the Kremlin. And I think we've got to take the threat seriously, but we shouldn't fall for the bluff, because if we do, it gives the Russians what they want for nothing.
Bashar Assad regime in Syria has collapsed. How do you see the main implications of this development for Vladimir Putin's reputation, his grip on power inside Russia and around the globe?
Well, the fall of Assad is a seismic event in the Middle East. It's a huge blow to the power of Iran. It's a real tribute to the Israeli military that's helped precipitate this by pummeling Hamas and Hezbollah. And it's another black eye for Putin, who didn't see it coming, didn't see the terrorist attack against the Assad regime coming, nor did the Iranians, nor did anybody else, as far as we can tell. We don't know much about what's transpiring in Syria today, but I would say at a minimum, the Russian naval base at Tartus and the air base at Latakia are in jeopardy. And if Russia lost those and that foothold on the Mediterranean, it would be an even more serious blow. It's something the Russian people and the Russian diaspora should be asking. Here's another catastrophic consequence of the invasion of Ukraine. The loss of those bases would be a huge blow to Russia. What exactly are we getting out of this war in Ukraine? That's what Russians should be asking themselves.
U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has invited President of China, Xi Jinping, to attend his inauguration, according to the CBS News. What is your reaction to such development, and what does this say about Trump's intentions, his plans on China?
Well, I think it's designed to increase the interest in the inauguration, to see if Xi Jinping comes. People who have searched the historical record say they're not aware of any foreign head of state attending an American president's inauguration as far back as they've been able to check since news reports of the invitation came out. I'd say it's unlikely that Xi would come, but not impossible. But it's a way, I think, unfortunately, of showing Xi Jinping how much he's on Donald Trump's mind. Ironically, it's a plus for the Chinese.
And what do you expect from Trump's policy on China, from your perspective?
Well, I think it could go either way. Right now, he's been very negative about China because he believes the COVID pandemic, which originated in Wuhan and dramatically and adversely affected economies all over the world, probably cost Trump the 2020 election. So he resents that. But if Xi Jinping were to say to him, Donald, we've got so many problems, you and I can solve them. Let's sit down. Let's negotiate the biggest trade deal in history. I think Trump would jump at it.
And do you expect such negotiations also with Kim Jong-un, leader of North Korean dictator?
Well, Trump has a lot of priorities at the beginning of the administration, but let's all remember that at one point, Trump said of Kim Jong-un, we fell in love with each other. So if any president of the United States who thinks that the head of North Korea has fallen in love with him is in for a rude surprise at some point. But I'm sure Trump would love to see his buddy, maybe even in Pyongyang, or maybe he'll invite Kim Jong-un to Washington.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.